1 minute. All right. Well, welcome those of you who are here. I'm sure that more will join us as we go. I'm Ben Kelly. I'm co-president of the Brookline Parents Organization, and on behalf of my other members of the organization, I'd like to welcome you all for coming tonight to this Surviving the Winter webinar. And you know, for those who don't know the Brookline Parents Organization, we're an organization that's kind of dedicated to advocating for Brookline parents in and around issues of education in our schools, and also trying to kind of get information out there about different things that are happening. We've done a number of webinars and kind of community conversations around the schools with school committee members and the superintendent and the teachers union and stuff like that. And we've started to do some others we did one about reading recently, and we wanted to do something that we thought would be helpful for everybody, which was this conversation about what can we do with our families this winter. So I won't talk too much about what we're going to do, because I'll leave that to the panelists and our moderator. But I just wanted to say thank you for joining. We hope you enjoy this. We hope you find it productive. Thank you to our panelists for joining us and providing their thoughts and their expertise. And I'll give it to Lauren Bernard, my co-president, to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Ben. Welcome, everyone. Tonight's webinar is entitled Getting Through the Pandemic Winter, something we all fear, from what I understand. I fear what I've heard from other parents. It's a daunting challenge, and here it is before us, although days like today are quite misleading. So tonight we put together a panel of experts in the fields of various sorts of child psychology, family psychology, brain science, community building, and our moderator is Stephen Ehrenberg, who is on the board of the BPO. And he's the father of 2 girls who go to Lawrence, and he holds a doctorate in international educational development from Teachers College at Columbia University, and has spent much of the past 15 years managing international education programs for large U.S. government-funded nonprofits. In his current work, Stephen designs programs to provide opportunities for vulnerable and marginalized youth to gain the skills they need to enter the working world. We're very pleased that he's agreed to moderate this for us. And take it away, Stephen. Let me just quickly introduce our panelists. And I'd like to preface this by saying that a lot of you are going to learn tonight. Public Schools of Brookline has had these expert advisory panels made up of parent volunteers. I have been honored to serve on panel 2, and thus I am familiar with our panelists. We serve on the same panel together, and they are brilliant and terrific people, and I'm thrilled that they agreed to do this. First, I'd like to introduce Amanda Tarullo. She's an associate professor of psychological and brain sciences at Boston University, and she's also director of the graduate program in developmental science at BU. She directs the Brain and Early Experiences Lab, and it's researching how things like chronic stress, sleep, and family experiences shape children's biological stress systems and brain development. So all of that is very apropos for what we're talking about. And one of the aims of her research is to identify protective factors that'll promote resilience in children in order to enhance intervention and help all children. So I think this is some very interesting research that she's bringing to bear on our conversation. Our second panelist, Lindsay Fallon, is an assistant professor in school psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She's a board certified behavior analyst and a licensed psychologist in Massachusetts. She holds a master's degree in special education, and her research focuses on feasible and effective support for families and teachers to promote behavioral health and wellness in youth. She partners with a number of school districts and is a trainer with the Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports Academy, funded by the Massachusetts Department of of Elementary and Secondary Education. Also, some great practical and interventional skills to bring to bear on our conversation. Sanjali Gidwani is the Director of Design for Change USA, and she sits on the board of directors for Design for Change Global. She manages a national team of designers, educators, technologists, and different partners that advise schools and organizations on how to leverage the power of design thinking, and we're going to learn a lot more about what design thinking is tonight, to engage young people in serving their communities. Sanjali has been a guest speaker at the National Association of Independent Schools, as well as at universities like Yale, Harvard, Ashoka, and the United Nations International School. We are very pleased to welcome all of you. Thank you for agreeing to do this, and I look forward to a very stimulating conversation. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, panelists, for showing up and joining us in this conversation. And thank you, participants. Thank you, listeners, for coming and listening to this conversation. I just want to say up front that this will be a 45-minute to an hour-long conversation, after which we hope to answer as many questions as possible. So feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screens to enter a Q&A. We'll be monitoring it, and we hope to involve you in the conversation after we've had our initial conversation. Also, as we talk, we've posted a bunch of links to brooklineparents.org, which is the BPO's website. That's it covers some of panel number 2's recommendations so far, as well as some of the resources that we're going to reference in the conversation. So hello, let me welcome you all again, and let's just jump right in. We're going to cover 3 main topics, and hopefully we'll ramble a bit on each. One is we're just going to have a quick conversation about panel 2, what it is and what it's recommended so far. And then I think we're going to talk a bit about trying to understand what our kids and we have gone through over the past 9 to 12 months while we tried to navigate hybrid and remote learning and the experience of multiple quarantines and lockdowns and various other schedule, life, existential disruptions. And then hopefully spend the most time on practical things, tips for how to keep a healthy and as happy as possible home environment as we head into what unfortunately looks like a winter of more quarantines, more lockdowns, more social distancing, less opportunity for activity with friends and family. So that's what we'd like to talk about. And let's just jump right in and talk about panel 2. What is it, all 3 of you? What is panel number 2? What's its mandate? And what have you found to date?
Well, I can start with that one. So panel 2 is support for the whole child experience. And so all of us are in some way involved in mental health and child emotional well-being. And so our role is to make recommendations that are reported to the school committee and to central administration. And our liaison is Maria Lataz, who's the head of K-12 guidance counseling for Brookline Public Schools. So as Stephen mentioned, the link is available. Our recommendations are posted on the BPO website, but a lot of our recommendations have centered around social emotional learning in the classroom and the importance of social emotional learning as a tier 1 intervention, meaning as an intervention for everybody. Given that in the situation of the pandemic, rates of depression and anxiety and child problems are doubling or tripling. One of the key things that we've been advocating for is to incorporate social emotional learning into children's classroom experiences and community building into children's classroom experiences to a greater extent, with the understanding that the majority of children or a large minority of children need extra support at this time. And I don't know, Lindsay, if you want to jump in with some of the other things we focused on.
Absolutely. And so Amanda mentioned you can see all of our presentations and recommendations on the Brookline Schools website, which is linked. But I'll highlight that we also talked a lot about family engagement, not just with the schools, but sort of with the community at large, since we're used to Brookline being a place where we could really engage with one another in a way that is not typical this year. So we've provided recommendations around just engagement with the community and how we can make that. Hopefully we can talk more about that tonight, because I think that's on a lot of people's minds. And I think that speaks to what Sanjali brings to the panel as well.
Wait, can we just back up a step? Who is your liaison in PSB right now?
It's Maria Lataz.
And what is her what is it that what is her area of responsibility typically?
Guidance counseling. So
Guidance
she is the central administrator for all the guidance counselors.
Okay, so she's already in charge of social and emotional well-being.
Right.
So could you sketch for us as broadly as possible what the kinds of recommendations you made for her for this period, given that she's already responsible for providing recommendations to PSB for the whole child, for social and emotional well-being? What additional recommendations have you made for this period?
Well, I don't know that we made any additional, well, we definitely made additional recommendations, but we sort of recommended a shift in how we might approach this year, in the sense of, as Amanda mentioned, thinking about the needs as being more of a tier 1 needs, rather than thinking about determining a small percentage of students who might require additional support, thinking about what we can do for all students. So we encourage, one of the things we did was really think about how can we build in some of the supports that we might traditionally reserve for a handful of students to really benefit everyone, because so many students we expected would be going into this year really needing emotional and social support in a way that we hadn't seen before.
I would also just add to that while she is our liaison, we also have been in contact with Superintendent Marini and with Meg Massini, who directs the RLA, and others, so that some of what we were recommending was not specific to implementation by guidance counselors. And much of that was around ways to make remote learning more developmentally appropriate, and ways to build community remotely, and to take burden off parents, to leverage parents as partners in their children's learning, but also to organize things in such a way that it was easier for children to navigate on their own, and that they had more supports through the classroom. So that's kind of another area. So more broadly, panel 2 is around social emotional well-being of children, and some of that is mediated by the guidance counselors and some of it is not.
Okay. I know that the administration has had its hands full during this period, planning for remote learning, planning for hybrid learning. That's been an administration in transition. I certainly am not looking to. I just want to understand the extent to which Panel 2's recommendations have been heard in your opinion. Have any of your recommendations been accepted? Do you think? How have your recommendations been implemented, do you think, to date?
Well, I think one of the priorities, which I don't know the extent to which it was our influence, but we were really strongly encouraging of reinstating the wellness coordinator for the district, which did indeed happen. So that we celebrated as sort of a win, because we saw it as a priority for our panel, and then it was reinstated. To answer your first question, I think, I have a lot of empathy for the district in going through what must have been a very challenging summer and extremely challenging year. And so I was really grateful for their presence at our panel meetings and just listening and responding and being so engaged. But I think we provided a lot of suggestions, and I don't know the extent to which, it was possible to implement everything we said. But I do think that there's been follow-up, and we expect we're meeting this Tuesday. We're hoping to follow up on some of the things that we are still wishing to be implemented. And I imagine they'll be fairly on board with the conversation.
Okay. And just one last question on this. Amanda, what were the categories of recommendations that Panel 2 issued?
We issued recommendations around physical wellness. So looking at the strong connections between physical health and mental health, and kids being more sedentary. And so ways to increase physical wellness, increase kids' motion during the day. Recommendations around social emotional wellness, K to 6, social emotional wellness, 6 to 12. And extracurriculars. And so Sanjali really led the way on that, looking at extracurriculars and community building and the way that they could have a role in children's wellness. And then the last category was parent engagement.
Okay. Okay. So those 4 categories, just to reiterate, if you go to brooklineparents.org, there's a link currently that we posted that has those top line recommendations that you could find. It's in one of the top couple of paragraphs. Okay. So I just wanted to get that out up front. That's panel 2's works. That's what links all of our panelists today. Let's start talking about the impact of the last year's worth of disruptions on kids and families. And let's start with kids. Lindsay, can we start with you? Can you start to give an overview of the kinds of issues that have started to manifest with children as they've tried to navigate the pandemic, with remote learning, hybrid learning? What kinds of cognitive difficulties have they encountered? What kinds of social difficulties? What kind of social emotional difficulties? How would you even start to talk about a framework for looking at the kinds of difficulties they've had?
Right. And I think before I mentioned this is unprecedented, and that's the first word that comes to mind for me, in the sense of, I know my own experience with my children, my friends' experiences with their children, my professional colleague, I know what I've heard, but we don't have a lot of research yet. And that's going to take years really to understand sort of what will come of this and what students or youth are experiencing right now. But what I can say is that my assumption and the data that I have seen indicate that they're at risk for a variety of sort of implications of this period of social isolation, with a lot of transitions going on around school, and being remote for a while, and then transitioning to a hybrid model if parents opted into that particular option. So there's like the risk associated with social isolation. There's all of the transitions, just the flexibility required to make those transitions. There is a lot of anxiety because the outcome of COVID is still relatively unknown. I think with the vaccine on the horizon, we're feeling a little bit more hopeful, but kids are very intuitive around parent stress too. And so I'm sure Amanda can speak to this, but if youth can sense that. So I think there's been a lot of challenges that could present themselves, although what we know about trauma, and I'm not necessarily saying that this has been a traumatic experience, although for some it has, is that trauma is perceived differently by different individuals. So it's how an experience is perceived. There's no one way to experience trauma, but that is certainly on the table for how this could be impacting children.
Amanda, I see you nodding. Did you want to add on to that?
Sure. I would just add that, as Lindsay was mentioning, parental stress is really picked up on by kids. And one of the things that we know in my field is that parents' biological stress is strongly predictive of the kids' biological stress. And by that, I mean levels of stress hormones and of the kids' well-being. And self-reported stress is sometimes completely unrelated to what's going on biologically. If you've ever had the experience, like when you were in college, you take exams and right after the exams you get sick, right? Because your biological stress hormones were going into overdrive and then your immune system collapses, right? So that's like, or if you have psychosomatic symptoms, like you have stomach aches or headaches, some of that can be all about stress that your body is doing kind of on its own, separate from your self-report. And so what I really want to emphasize is that most of us right now are under a lot of biological stress, right? Most of us are having a stressful time, even those who feel like they're coping well and are saying they're fine, right? And kids pick up on that, and the kids are too, right? And the kids are through us. So I think Lindsay's absolutely right that stress within families leads to more family conflict, leads to, the social isolation is a stressor on everybody. And I would just also add the executive function demands of the past 9 months have increased everybody's stress of the change, unpredictability and changeability of what's happening from day to day and week to week. The demands of kids needing to remember all these extra rules that they need to follow for safety and inhibit their impulses to want to run up and hug their friend, right? The demands of navigating Zoom links and tracking all of that, and of parents trying to multitask, like tell your kid how to spell something at the same time that you're in a meeting, right? And that, you know, all of us are doing 2 jobs at once all day whenever our kids are home. And all of that is just a lot of executive function demands on parents and kids. And that takes a toll over time as well.
Sanjali, what do you, when you look at, your expertise is more around looking at families, right? When you think about this, how do you start to think about it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you so much, Lindsay and Amanda, for putting it into such great context. The most important thing that I've been thinking about, I think a lot of parents have been thinking about, is making meaning out of what we've just been through. I think we are just going through the motions, but we're not actually stopping to think about how it's affecting us, how it's affecting our children. And so having those really important conversations, I mean, how many parents on this discussion today will ask their children, how are you doing? And their answer is fine. We're not all fine. We're actually far from it. And that's okay. And I think that knowing that that is okay, and not being fine is okay, is something that we actually have to learn to be okay with. For example, when the pandemic struck, we were very on top of our daughter, and we're like, you have to get everything done that's listed in your task list that was given to you by a teacher. But now we actually know it's okay if we didn't get to something. So that sense of having sense of empathy for yourself, starting as a parent, is really important, so we can model the importance of our children having empathy for their own selves. So I think that's a really important place to start.
Thanks, Anjali. Yeah, I definitely want to spend a lot of time on that topic, especially on the topic of how what you would suggest to increase our empathy so we don't strangle each other over the winter. But I want to spend a little more time right now if you would, to help us dig a little deeper, to just to simply understand what it might be like to be a kid going through this. Just to anatomize the kind of responses children might be having right now. I think, Amanda, you outlined some of the stress responses, picking up on the biological stress, exhaustion or stress from having overtaxed executive functions. What is the impact of that? Is it exhaustion? Is it anger? Is it, I mean, surely it's variable depending on the kid, but are there general, I mean, can you describe categories of consequence that result from those demands on kids?
Absolutely. And before I get into that, I do want to just add one other piece, which is that most kids' sleep has been disrupted over the past 9 months greatly. Bedtime routines kind of go out the window a little bit when you're not physically leaving the house in the morning, right? When you have different schedules from day to day, then the timing of bedtime starts varying widely. Kids may be sleeping late some days and not other days. Kids may be anxious and having trouble falling asleep. And the reason I bring that up now is because sleep and executive function are also really closely related. There's research showing that if you curtail just 1 hour a night of kids' sleep, you see greatly diminished executive function the next day. So those are very closely linked. And I would guess that most children right now are not getting enough sleep because of all the factors going on. Screens close to bedtime also makes it hard to fall asleep, right? And all of our kids are on screens more than they used to be, right? So all of those sleep is just making the problem worse because that's another burden on executive function. So to answer your question, what happens when executive function is diminished? First of all, executive function develops gradually from preschool up through college. You don't reach your peak executive function until you're really an adult. It's one of the slowest developing things. And so there's a limit to it at every age. 6-year-olds just cannot have that great of an executive function. Their brain is not there yet. It's mostly, areas of the brain like the prefrontal cortex that are very slow developing. And so there's just an outer limit to what they can do on their own. Teenagers can do more, but again, it's still not fully mature. When executive function is overtaxed or is impaired because of sleep problems or stress, because stress also interferes with executive function, you see academic problems. Think about how do you sustain attention or inhibit your impulses to jump out of your chair and run away from the Zoom call, or not get distracted by your friend behind you who's playing with their mask, right? How do you do all that if your executive function is impaired? You don't, and that means that you miss things. So academic performance is affected by executive function. Social relationships are affected. If you know someone who's really impulsive, they can be hard to get along with, right? Because they don't know when to let you take your turn or to let you choose the activity or to not say the thing that's going to hurt your feelings. And so when our kids' social relationships their peer relationships are going to be affected by those impairments in executive function. Their emotional well-being is affected. Their relationships with their parents is affected. It's one of those things that kind of affects everything. And so that's why I focus on it so much, because the good news is if you can build it back up, then it also helps everything.
Lindsay, I'm curious about your response to this as someone who probably sees a lot of this in action.
Yeah, I mean, what Amanda spoke to really made me think about the value of routines. I think she even mentioned that in her response. And I think even as unstructured a time, this feels like there are opportunities for building routines in the household that, although they do take a little bit of time as far as, kind of setting them up and following through with them initially, will sort of there's a return on the investment. So once kids are sort of used to bedtime being a certain way, it becomes easier and easier and easier. I know personally, we have definitely been pretty bad about bedtime. And I know as a professional, we just need to, for like a week, be really diligent about it, have a routine in place and follow it, and then it'll be expected. And it will be not only great for us as parents, but great for our kids because they'll get the sleep they need. Kids love predictability. They typically love routine. They like to know what's coming. That's comforting, in addition to having that physiological kind of bucket filled of having enough sleep to be able to do well in school the next day and to be functioning at their best. So I see the value in routines as being really a critical piece here, even though it feels like, how can you have a routine during this insane time? So I'll just put that out there.
So they're under-rested, their executive functions are taxed, which is constraining their social relationships, it's constraining their academic achievement. Their schedules are disrupted, which is just jarring in general. What else is going wrong for our kids right now? Or going right? Like what other broad strokes can you paint about this year? What's driving my question is, what else can you tell us that can help us imagine what it might be like to be a kid right now, going through this, which is something that I don't think, for me anyway, I rarely feel that I have the space to do because I'm so occupied with being an adult going through this. I would love just to have a few moments with you all to try to imagine what it might be like to be one of my kids going through this, or one of your kids going through this.
One thing that found very personally as a mom is it's freed up a little bit of mental space for them when they no longer can go to all these after school classes that at one point kept them very, very highly structured. It freed up mental space for them to once again use their imaginations because there's a lot of time sometimes to be filled and it's free time and they have to think about what to do and they start coming up with new hobbies or trying new things, or that like activity box that was parked away somewhere on a shelf. They're starting to do things that they wouldn't have otherwise maybe had time to do. So it's freeing up some imaginative space in their minds. Yeah, I think so, at least. It's hard though when they're bored, right? It's hard when they're telling you they're bored, but I think boredom is sometimes the key to building that imagination and creativity and having that come back, is allowing them to be bored and finding something to do. And they always come back and surprise me on what they've come up with, whether it be building a fort or doing some imaginative play or picking up a new hobby and coloring. It could be anything. It could be the simplest things, but it just, they have the space, I feel, in their mind to do that. And it also allows them to get into sort of a flow of processing maybe what happened that day, if they can just mentally detach from what school is and do some free play that can take them out of that zone for a little while.
What about helping us empathize with ourselves a bit right now? Can you describe for us some of the I keep wanting to say pathologies, but I keep backing away from it. Can you describe for us some of what's surfaced for adults, for grown-ups over the past 9 to 12 months? What social emotional obstacles have arisen, do you think, for adults as they navigate their families through remote learning, hybrid learning, pandemic, quarantine, etc.? And this
I
is
think,
for all.
yeah, I think the little time, if any of us did this, and I hope many of us did before the pandemic, is carve out time for ourselves to do the things that brought us happiness, whether it be a specific hobby, an interest, even just taking a walk by yourself. I feel that we have lost a lot of that sense of control over our time. And then also this need to constantly be on and plugged in and supporting our kids, that we forget that we still actually really need to fill our own hearts and minds with the things that bring us happiness, because it's really, you know, on a personal example, I used to dance all the time, once a week. That was my time. That's since has gone away, but trying to figure out a way to bring that back and share it with my kids was really important, because I felt like I was a better parent if I did that. I'm really curious to hear what Amanda and Lindsay say about this as well. I do not at all have a scientific answer for that, but that's just from personal experience.
No, absolutely, Sanjali. I would second everything that you said. I'd say as adults, we're going through most of the same things our kids are, right? We're also lonely. We're also socially isolated. We also miss our relatives and our friends. We also have no boundaries anymore between work or school and home. We also are sometimes feeling like we're spending too much time with our families and could use a break from the few people that are in our bubble, right? All of those things are happening to both of us. And I guess the one thing that I would say is, self-care that Sanjali is saying is so important is not a luxury, and it's not selfish. You can't be present for your kid. You can't be emotionally available for your kid if your emotions are out of control. And by that, I don't mean anything judgmental at all. Just all of us are more depressed and more anxious, have more difficulty concentrating to varying levels than we did before this. And so, for example, you kind of want to treat whatever is the symptom that's coming up. If you're feeling sad, if you're feeling drained, you want to do some kind of self-care to build that energy up, whether it's listening to an upbeat song or going for a walk. If you're feeling super stressed, then you want to do some kind of self-care that helps to soothe your nerves, like, light a scented candle or listen to more soothing music. Take a minute just to yourself, right? If you're feeling really upset, then you want to, try some deep breathing. So there's what kind of, and we, this is posted on the Panel 2 site as well under parent self-care tips. But what kind of self-care might help you in a moment kind of has to do with where your mood is. What's going to help to either soothe you or to re-energize you. And it's really, I think it's so hard to fit in, and it can feel like I have to do my job and I have to at the same time take care of my kid and there's no time left. And I don't have time to sleep either, right? And like, what happens when we don't sleep? Then our mood and our executive function are also, worse off as well. So I would just really second what Sanjali is saying, that sleep and self-care are absolutely critical for your well-being, but almost even more so for your kids' well-being.
I wanted to pick up on something, Amanda, that, your suggesting is also it's again going back to the modeling. If we don't model, we can't be like stress buckets and tell our kids, oh, you should do deep breathing. That's going to be really helpful when we are not at all doing it ourselves. So the more that we can take care of ourselves, they will hopefully see that and want to take care of themselves and or mimic that kind of behavior, which would be a really positive behavior to mimic rather than the crazy frazzled mom that I usually am every day. So.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly that the saying "you can't pour from an empty cup" resonates, and I've heard it a lot during this pandemic. But I love and I appreciate the suggestions of doing things that bring you joy. I feel like what I've needed the most is just being able to have more time, and so one of my mentors professionally has really encouraged me to be better about saying no, which I was not good at, I would say, and it's probably still not great at, but she has 3 rules. She says, you should say no if you don't want to do it, don't have time to do it, and it doesn't align with your values. Because I think, and I guess I'm speaking more professionally right now, if you're saying yes to things that you don't have time for, you're probably not going to be able to do a great job with it. And you're just probably putting more on someone else's plate anyway. So giving yourself permission to say no to things that you really don't have time for, to give you the time that you need to do your job, to be a parent, to be to help teach your child, to be their social emotional support. So having empathy for yourself by allowing yourself to say no when you can.
So this is great, and I feel like what you're saying to me feels like really foundational, healthy reminders about how to be like a human being in the world. And in some ways, it feels like a really basic reminder of how to cope with modernity. Like this is good advice in all times, not just these times. It seems like the problems that we're facing in this diagnosis is a difference of degree rather than kind. Like that we're strapped for time. We're strapped for time for caring for ourselves. What I find myself wondering is COVID, is the pandemic presenting any problems that are different in kind as well? Like there are also 250,000 Americans dead who weren't dead last year of COVID. Our children have to wear masks out in public. The littler ones don't really understand what's going on. A relative of mine was telling his mother yesterday that he was afraid of her dying and wanted to be with her more. Like there are other things happening that are different. And like I sometimes I find myself thinking, well, like, our generation didn't have anything close to this. Maybe the previous generation thought about, like, preparing for nuclear attacks and being under their desks and thinking of some existential threat or something like that. Maybe that's a little bit closer. I guess it's a little bit closer, but surely there's something different in what's going on here. That's just like we have to step up our self-care routines, our care for our prioritization of how we care, who we care for. Are there other, perhaps I'm not asking this well, I guess I just want to ask, are there new things that you think are cropping up because of COVID that weren't there before?
I think yes. I think the fear and uncertainty and unpredictability are just at another level than in the normal stresses of daily life. That as a nation, as a world, really, there's this fear of getting sick, fear of losing people, right? But just a lot of uncertainty about what your life is going to look like from week to week, or from month to month, or sure can't plan for next year, right? And when you pair that with social isolation, that's a lot. There's a lot of research showing that we, like most animal species, find the most stressful thing to be unpredictability. So for example, if you have foraging animals and either their food is in predictable places or it's in unpredictable places, even if they get the same total amount of food, they show way more stress when it's unpredictable. So we are really, and that there's a lot of research on that in humans as well. The unpredictability of this time and the way that we just don't know what our future is going to be like a few months down the road really takes a big toll on us and on kids. But what I would say is that Sanjali mentioned modeling. our kids' future is unpredictable. We hope that this is the worst thing they have to go through, but we don't know what else could be in their future, what hard times might be ahead for them, either at a societal level or at an individual level. And so I think one silver lining of this is that it's an opportunity for us to model coping, and for us to teach our kids how to get through the unimaginable, and how to be resilient, and how to seek social support when you need it, and how to talk about your emotions. And so, I think we're not doing our kids any favors if we pretend we're okay, right? It's actually better to be like, I'm sorry, I'm grumpy, I'm feeling really sad today because I don't get to see grandma for Christmas. Like, that's better to help give them, or it seems like you're really sad about this, or you're pretty frustrated because you're all done with Zoom today. So I think trying to model for our kids how to process emotions and how to cope with the unimaginable is going to help them be prepared to get through this, but also to get through whatever lies ahead in their lives.
That's a lovely comment, and let's use that to segue into the third part of this conversation, which is the pragmatic part. And let's focus on tips now, and let's start with exactly what you said. And how do you model resilience? How do you model coping? What are some specific strategies, ways of thinking about it, ways of going about modeling those things that you think about? I guess I'll start with you, Sanjali, since it seems like you're very deliberate in thinking about how you do this as a mother, but also how you do this with families and communities.
Absolutely. So through the work that I do at Design for Change, one of the things that we noticed is that not only do young people want to make meaning, having empathy isn't enough. They want to take action. So they want to make meaning, and then they want to take meaningful action. So they want to do good in the world as a way to not just process what they're going, but helping others process what they're going through. So one of the books that I love, it's sort of my parenting Bible, written by one of my mentors, Rick Weisberg. He wrote a book called The Parents We Mean to Be. And it's a we mean to be. And so it's about, and he has this wonderful concept of circles of concern. And one of the things that the pandemic has taught us is who has been out of our circle of concern for so long. Like, when have I ever cared about the delivery driver? When have I ever cared about the man that owns a pizza shop down the street? And so in thinking about who is in our immediate circle of concern, of course, our families, then our neighbors, then our friends, and then the delivery provider, the personnel, the doctors, our circle of concern through the pandemic, at least we've seen through the Design for Change program, has really expanded for our students. So they're now thinking about so many other people and how they can serve them. And it's been really beautiful because, for example, my daughter, to process her own feelings, created these glitter jars. I actually have one. She brought me one here. They look like this. And it was just a simple act, but then she's like, well, if I can do this for myself, why can't I do it for my whole class? So it was those simple, tiny little acts that actually helped her get through what she was feeling, but then also in a way that was in service to others, and helping them get through. So there was like this really great benefit of trying to do things for others that ended up coming back to you tenfold because you had empathy and you were able to show others empathy and pay it forward. They're probably having a better day now. So finding ways to be very deliberate and meaningful in doing small, simple, kind acts every day is actually personally benefiting, I think.
Lindsay, what do you think about when you think about the question of modeling resilience and modeling coping strategies?
I think my immediate thought was almost literally modeling. So I was thinking about how in the mornings, I'm already a late person. I'm rushing the kids out of the house prior to the COVID pandemic. But now, because we've opted into hybrid, we have 2 days in school. So if we're late, my anxiety is a little bit amplified. So the kids see that and they sense it. But I try to make a point when I see myself or feel myself getting a little bit elevated to process it like out loud and just say, oh, well, I'm feeling a little like we need to be out of here. I know tomorrow I'm going to try to start this, start us getting out of here 5 minutes earlier. Just try to model or talk through what I'm thinking and how I might try to change or cope with the stress I'm feeling in that moment. And who knows if they're listening really, but I think just saying things out loud and processing it and talking to them about how they're feeling, you know, sitting around, if you're able to sit around the dinner table, asking them, we always say, what was your rose? What was your thorn? And just connecting and hearing what they say and processing it with them that way. And you can maybe be able to model in that moment of, oh, well, what could you have done differently if you see an opportunity?
Amanda, do you have any theoretically grounded strategies for modeling resilience or coping strategies?
I think I would just add everything that's been said is I would concur with, and then what I would add is the importance of positive relationships and social support. So that's the thing that is the most empirically supported, is that strong social connections are the best predictor of resilience. Resilience is not something where some of us are born resilient and others are born hopelessly non-resilient. Like that, resilience is a product partly of genetics, but mainly of your experiences. And when you dig closer, even at kids, for example, kids growing up in war zones, or kids who have, you know, experienced extreme poverty or experienced a family traumas, the ones who do best usually had a strong social connection to somebody, right? And or to multiple people. And so the importance of social relationships, I think, is something to model. Us continuing to make efforts to stay in touch with relative and friends, right? Doing that for our kids, but also for ourselves, showing that like social connections matter. This is important. Us making time for our kids, even when it feels like there is no time, and modeling that, and time for our spouses, and just modeling the idea of asking for help and saying when you're overwhelmed, and like articulating, I just cannot take this anymore, right? I just cannot deal with this right now. I need to go take a walk. I need to, you know, modeling those times when it's too much, instead of just storming out or just, you know, whatever, but still leaving when you need to leave, or still, you know, taking that moment when you need to take that moment, but articulating why. And the idea that then hopefully there's someone else in the household who can fill in for you, and that you're modeling that ability to support each other and hand things off, and lean on each other when you need to. I think that's, and so many people, especially kids, feel like they need to act like they're fine, and they feel like they need to sort of be the heroes. And so modeling that ability to ask for help and to lean on each other.
I think that I find myself still coming back to this central question in my mind, though, which is, how is this different under COVID? These all seem like wise life lessons that you're proposing, that we are more or less capable of hearing at different times in our life, under different conditions. So when things are good, we're more capable of doing these things, of making time for. No, you disagree, Amanda?
I think when things are good, we're less capable, because then it doesn't feel so urgent. I actually think that people are more receptive in a way. At least I'd love to hear what Lindsay and Sanjali think, but my instinct is actually that people are more receptive now. You're right. A lot of this is not new. It's just intensified. But so people feel desperate, right? And so they're more receptive to thinking about some of those things in a way that before that, you know, your work presentation or your kids' math homework or whatever else, you know, felt so urgent, and there didn't feel like there was space to think about this. But I'd love
we
to hear.
We shouldn't waste this crisis.
Yeah.
What do you think?
This pandemic has taught, I think, all of us so much about, you know, to an earlier comment that I had made about, sometimes, is it just okay? Is it okay if it's just good enough? So that has been a very interesting forced reflection about how we engage as a family unit, how we engage with others. The other thought I had after hearing what you said, Amanda, was that our social relationships have evolved in various different ways. Either we have narrowed our social interactions to a subgroup of people that we actually realize that we feel much closer to, or we've prioritized a relationship in a different way, or we've also evolved relationships with people that we never thought were in our circle. For example, at the school that my son and daughter are at, we've created an equity path of parents where we engage students in racial discussions. And there's a lot of students who think about these things all the time and are concerned about race and justice and equality and inclusiveness. And so we have a read aloud every Wednesday, and it introduced, especially my older daughter, to a whole new group of people that are thinking about things that she's thinking about. So I think our relationships with people have evolved in various different ways, but we have really been forced to reflect on our relationships. It's just something that we have to do.
And I love everything that was just said. I was just going to echo both of their points and saying that this feels different because I think it's intensified. There are health disparities tied to race and ethnicity, economic status, and gender, right? This is very gendered. And I think in terms of what things are like for a lot of women right now, as the primary caregiver, and many of whom are working outside of the home or working for jobs that are typically outside of the home, healthcare workers, frontline workers, this has been different. So not necessarily completely unlike everything we've ever experienced, but definitely amplified, intensified, and different.
Okay, let's talk about the winter. It's coming. It was nice today. It's not going to be nice for much longer. How are we going to deal? We, most of us are trying to get out, take some walks, go on hikes, see people in a socially distanced way. A lot of that's going to disappear as it gets really cold. So we're going to be stuck at home, and however many square feet we have, with however much winter clothes we have. What do you got? How are we going to stay sane over these winter months as the pandemic worsens over the next few months, most likely, and as the vaccine gets closer but not close enough?
Well, I don't have the magical answer that.
Oh, well, then we're going to have to end this conversation.
But I will go back and say a point I wanted to make earlier that I think is important now too, is that I talked a lot about routines and the value of predictability, but I also think flexibility is really important to teach too. And I wanted to make that point, but also say that maybe we go into this winter. My idea is kind of fun. I think Angela and Amanda have really deep, important ideas, but my idea is that we look to the winter and we think about how can we come up with sort of a schedule every week, like Monday is this theme, Tuesday is this day, Wednesday is this day. And we build that predictability into our time, but also teach flexibility. Like, all right, so we're not going to do Taco Tuesday this week. So, oh, well, but have come up as a family, with ideas to make every day special or unique and kind of have that predictability built in. But also teaching that, if we don't stick to the schedule, we'll be all right too.
I think that's so great, Lindsay. I love the idea of theme days. And I also think that we need to let our kids lead some of this and take the work off of our plates. They're fully capable. And they're only going to rise to the bar of the expectation we set for them, right? So if we set the expectation up here, they'll rise to it, and they will always pleasantly surprise us, or maybe they don't surprise us. I don't know. But I think that we just need to give them more onus on owning what they want to do, how they want to be engaged. Maybe they don't know. Maybe we can start small. I don't know. But there's a lot to be said about letting them have a voice and having an opinion. And then the only second thing, because obviously I'm a huge proponent of this, is engage them in service, engage them in doing good, and do it as a family. Build that community at home. Start there, start really, really small, and build it up over time, because there's so much to be said about just collecting food for a food drive. There is so much to be said about leaving a kind note on your door for your delivery driver who's delivering your Amazon packages. It's really in those simple moments that I think that families really come together around a shared experience that also does good for somebody else. So that would be my recommendation, is find those really small things that you can do as a family.
Leslie, will you say some, if you wouldn't mind, would you continue with some of those ideas? I think just throwing out some of these ideas that's a rich vein that you've struck there. And I think, I'm listening to them. I bet a bunch of people who are listening are also interested to hear more. What else have you got in that vein?
Yeah, we've done a few different things, and I've seen a lot of families do a variety of things from the two ideas that I had already mentioned. Another thing I've seen students do is interview people and create people that inspire them. So it could be. I've had a student interview a high school student who had recently revealed that she was bisexual. And what was her story and why is that so inspiring? So going through these interviews, and sometimes you can even do them on family over Zoom. We've done things like those fleece knotted blankets for homeless people. Winter is coming. They need to be warm. You can collect socks. You can collect even the smallest thing. You can have a theme around it. By making those fleece knotted blankets, you can look up any YouTube tutorial and do a whole bunch of those. Or even if you want to extend it even further, invite the entire class to do it as well in your child's school, so you can connect with all the other parents. You can all make your blankets over Zoom and show them off and have somebody deliver them. There's so many different things that we can do, and I can share a link for you where we have a whole variety of challenges that we have for students through Design for Change that are really simple, small, kind acts that can be done from the safety of your home.
That's great. Amanda, do you have any suggestions as well?
Those were amazing. I'm writing them down too. I would suggest, I think the one thing that I can add is around processing what's missing this winter, processing kids lost this winter, whether it's that it's not, the Christmas or holiday that they would have normally experienced, that they're not going to get to see the people they would normally see, or they don't get to play hockey, or, whatever would normally happen that isn't happening. I think it's important to process. I know my daughter, before she goes to bed, draws what she wants to dream. And the night before Thanksgiving, she drew the Thanksgiving table at my aunt's house with all the people who would be there that she wasn't going to see. And, we hadn't really talked about it. I didn't really think about that it was going to be that upsetting to her, but it was, that was a way of processing. And then I'm like, oh, I should have planned this, right? But she did it on her own, processing what's not happening. And talking to the kid about what need did that fulfill? What did your hockey team do for you? What needs did that fulfill for you? And what do you feel like you're missing? Is it social contact, or is it the sense of competition, or is it, just energizing, or the exercise? What is it? And then trying to brainstorm about other ways to meet those needs for now. So, there's not one recipe for every kid, but trying to just process with the kid the things they're sad about missing. What did those mean to them? What is it that they feel is the sense of loss? And are there other ways to try to temporarily meet those needs?
I love the thought of looking for indirect ways to process what's been lost. Do you have any suggestions for how to draw out that processing? I mean, I know to do it directly often is to run into a brick wall. Sometimes we'll have success here with doing some, some imagination oriented play where you can transfer some of the work onto the creatures that you're animating, although that always turns into, they're always orphaned in the end. But that's another issue. We don't have to talk about that here. But do you have any suggestions for ways that you can elicit that processing from kids without pressuring them to do it, without pressuring them to perform their loss or their feelings for you as their grown-ups for whom they already have to do so much?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to hear how the Lindsay and Tantali weigh
Yeah,
in.
Lindsay, I guess that's really that's in your domain.
Well, and I think part of it, I think, is just having sort of low expectations about what you might get out of a conversation. Maybe that's not the best way to frame it, but I would just express that you're open and that you're interested. And it might not happen in that moment, but planting that seed. I'm also specifically thinking about students or kids who are a little bit older, and just having, just expressing that you're around, that you're there. Maybe you can ask directly, but you can also ask sort of indirectly in certain ways, or ask about topics that are related and sort of work, like build a rapport in your conversation and then sort of transition rather than like leading with a question. That's a strategy. But I think, again, going back to modeling empathy, modeling listening, acknowledging that you're there, and interested, I think is important. And I might have more ideas once I hear what the others say, but it's challenging for sure. Oh, I was going to say one more thing, that I think I wouldn't shy away from the conversation for a younger child either. I think the language has to be a little bit different, and it has to, just be more developmentally appropriate, matched to what they're able to express, what they're able to understand. But I still think you should be talking about it with younger kids as well.
Sanjali, do you want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, I think Lindsay, you said it so eloquently. I mean, it reminds me a lot of like play-based therapy almost, where you just engage them in doing an activity, and through the activity comes out conversation. I totally agree that asking them point blank, I always just get fine. Everyone's fine. Everyone's good. How was your day? Good. So I get that a lot, but there's so much more to be dug into there. There's this really great book that I came across. I think it's called The Big Life Journal. And it was like these daily kind of nighttime, like you can, my daughter just kind of goes through it every night and does a couple of pages, but it actually has some prompting questions, and you have a reading buddy, usually a mom or a dad, that can read alongside you, and you have these engaging conversations. And sometimes it has nothing to do with the pandemic. It's just like, tell me about a time that was really hard for you, or tell me about a moment where, oh, thank you. Right on cue. Look at that. It's called The Big Life Journal. This book is awesome, awesome, awesome. And it, yeah. And then she said there's more additions. But it's just like a nice opportunity to start a conversation that might lead down a certain path. But I found it really helpful in our nighttime talks.
Thanks, Sanjali. Amanda,
I would just add just a little bit to that. With older kids who are a little too old for play-based kind of conversations, I think one way to do it is to try to get them to write about it, or draw a comic about it. Something like that, that's a little more indirect. And then something that also is a recommended strategy is, instead of saying, how are you, or how do you feel about that, to kind of give numbers to things. So what are 2 things that you're grateful for today that happened? Or, what were 2 things that really upset you today? Or, what are, 3 reasons that you're sad that hockey's canceled, right? So that, and when you put it that way, it's harder for them to just say fine. Right. I mean, teenagers can shut things down if they want to shut things down. They're going to do that anyway. Right. But at least you're creating a structure that makes it harder for kids to just brush off. And if you start by sharing that for yourself too, that's also modeling, 2 things that upset me today were, right. How about you?
Thanks, Amanda. I want to take some time now to ask some of the questions that have come in today and previously. And I want to encourage the people listening, if you have questions, please go ahead and ask them and I will relay them. The first question I have has come in from a number of people: screens. So I think a lot of us are anticipating that with the cold weather will come the temptation to shove the child in front of a screen for longer and longer periods of time. What I want to start by asking is specifically to Amanda, first of all, what's the research on the impact of screens over any length of time? Is there good research on what the impact of screens is? And then more broadly, let me open that up. What do you see as some of the, more anecdotally, as the impact of increased screen usage time among kids during this time? And do you recommend avoiding it? If so, how? And if not, why?
So the research on screens, the main problem with screens is what's missed while you're on the screen. So for example, kids have smaller receptive vocabularies if they watch many hours of TV a day, but that's not because of something's evil about the screen itself. It's because while they're doing that, there's no one talking to them. There's no one engaging with them, right? So it's not, I wouldn't worry in these times too much about how many minutes of screen. There can also be benefits. For example, there are small motor benefits of playing a lot of video games, right? There's research on that. So there can be some technical skills our kids are gaining through all this engagement with screens that they might not have at this age otherwise. But the biggest thing that I would emphasize is that most of the research on screens has been research with passive screen viewing. And what's happening now, many of the hours our kids are spending on screens are contingent, which means that someone on the other end is responding to them and interacting with them. And that's just completely different in nature. And there is research showing that children learn much better and get much more out of contingent screen interactions than they do out of passive screen interactions. And so I would hope that that would allay some folks' concerns a bit, that don't be so worried about something you read saying your kid shouldn't be on screens for more than 2 hours a day. That wasn't the same kind of screen.
Okay. Okay. Any other comments on that, Lindsay?
No, I would just add that I think this goes back to our discussion of empathy and allowing yourself to forgive yourself if you find yourself exceeding that threshold that you've set for your family, because this is such a unique time, and acknowledging that maybe you'll go back to something more regimented once we're more in the clear. But for now, give yourself a little bit of empathy or permission to do things differently.
Sanjali, any thoughts on screens?
No, I thought I could make a smart comment of like, get them to watch a really great documentary. I was like, I've had no success with that. But I will say Saturday morning, they get themselves a bowl of cereal and let us sleep in. And that is a lot of self-care in the morning. So I think it's okay on the weekends, take a little bit of break, you know, in family movie night. Like there's opportunities to still very much have quality screen time. It's Amanda, Lindsay, you probably speak to this so much better with your expertise, but it probably has a lot to do with what they're watching and the content of it, rather than just like passive engagement. Like, you know, if it's high quality, really great stuff and they're learning something, hopefully it's not a bad thing.
Is there any research, Amanda, on whether it impairs socialization?
There's some research that if you watch a lot of aggressive, violent things, then that can lead to aggressive behavior problems, although it's very complicated, because kids who are given free rein to watch a lot of violent things that are sort of not age appropriate, also there's often other factors going on in the household. And so that research has been criticized a lot, because there's no real evidence of causation. It may instead be that children who are watching a lot of violent things also are experiencing family stress, or the parents are very, don't have time to monitor them for whatever reason, and that's more what's going on. So I'm very hesitant to say that that there's research related to socialization, except kids who are on screens all day, and if it's socially isolated time on screens, then they're not getting enough social interaction, and that's a concern. But if they're on screens because they're chatting with their friend on Zoom, I wouldn't be worried about that at all.
Okay, I will cease my Tipper Gore questioning. Quick aside to Sanjali, you showed a book just now, and a questioner wants to know what the title of that book was. Do you still have it on you? The book, can you show it? It is called Big Life Journal. And who's it by, or who publishes it? Do you see it? Well, we'll post further information on the BPO website.
I can send a link to the book if that's helpful.
Okay. Related to potential socialization issues, someone asks, could you address how to help angry teens who are missing their friends and even have friends that are getting together at each other's homes inside? I realize that's a complicated question.
Yeah, that's really tough. I mean, and I think their anger is justified, honestly, because they are, they're used to a certain way of living, and they're seeing, they're being held to a standard that maybe isn't the standard that others are being held to. And so that feels unfair. So I think it goes back to our discussion of just, if you're able to process that a little bit with them around, yeah, this is really unfair. This is, and I don't have a teenager at this point, but what I say to my 9-year-old is that this is not going to be forever. I promise you this won't be forever. Hopefully I'm not lying, but I think, really trying to help them acknowledge that this isn't in the moment thing, but to also just feel, to understand that what they're going through is very, very hard. And I mean, I imagine all of us, I can't even imagine being, a high school student, not getting to experience for better or for worse, not getting to experience what we experienced. So I have a lot of empathy for youth going through a tough time right now. But I think, again, just sort of opening up the opportunity to process with them, and trying to see if you can come up with creative ideas for them to spend time with friends, that doesn't feel so isolating. So maybe Sanjali has good ideas about that too. But I think, you can still see people. It's just you have to exercise caution.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't, for some families, it's a possibility to open up that bubble just slightly. And for some, it's just completely not. And to have your child, what's the word I'm looking for, validate what they're feeling, is a really important place to start. Lindsay, I think you've already talked about that, which I think is really important. But then also, again, letting them have a voice at the table of like, if I can't do this, what else can I do? And have that be an open conversation and negotiation, and within reasonable limits. We are all still parents at the end of the day, and we have to set those limits for our children. But letting them have a voice in that, and coming up with those creative ways, letting, and trying to figure it out as a family. I think the direct no is only going to make them want it even more. So what else could we do? What else would make you feel better about the situation, which is an open dialogue.
Essentially. Amanda, anything you'd like to add to that? Yeah. Another question, and this one I think is for you, Amanda. And this is getting back to something we were discussing earlier. What protective factors, the questioner asks, are you observing or researching relating to trauma and or COVID that as parents we could focus on?
Great question. I'll just start by saying we don't know yet for COVID specifically. That there's a lot of COVID research underway. There are a lot of amazing people who were not me who immediately wrote grants in April while I was trying to just like juggle the absolute glass balls, right? But some people were super ambitious and immediately started longitudinal studies. And there are some great studies going on, including studies of women who were pregnant at the about to give birth in New York when things got bad this spring, compared to women who had just given birth, and even looking at the prenatal effects of COVID. So there's some amazing research underway, and in a few years we'll have a lot more information. But for now, what we know has to do with just what we know about past chronic stress and trauma research. And I would go back. We need to go back to what we know is most important for kids. We know that, as I mentioned earlier, social relationships are a really important protective factor. The quality of the parent-child relationship is really important. For kids kind of middle school and high school age, that's an age where developmentally their focus shifts to peers. And so peer relationships become an important protective factor. However, there's research showing us that those do not, they're a protective factor, but they're also a source of stress. And a source of, being self-conscious and trying to be cool and, all of that. And so they don't substitute for the parent. So for children of that age, the peer relationships and the parent relationship are important protective factors. Sleep is a big one, as I've mentioned. Getting enough sleep, especially nighttime sleep, and going to bed at the same time every night is a really important protective factor. And financial security of the family. I realize that's not in a lot of people's control, but that's just a reality to know, that may removes a big stressor from families, has positive effects on everybody's stress level, on family dynamics. And then the last one that I would add is emotion regulation. And that's the one that I think is great to focus on, because it's one that's a little more in your control to try to help your child build. So we know that children that are better at managing their emotions, children that are better at coping when they're stressed out, do better in stressful situations, that it can actually affect how they process those chronic stressful situations. And so trying to build kids' capacities to regulate their emotions is helping them to build a protective factor. That, sleep, and social relationships, I think, are the big three that you can do something about, and that are malleable and that can change kids' outcomes.
Thanks, Amanda. Sorry, I was slightly distracted in part of that. What I wanted to ask you as part of that, though, is are there not comparable studies from like China during SARS or West Africa during Ebola? Maybe this isn't part of your field. Like, surely there are. Sure.
And I think the biggest risks are, for example, studies of earthquakes. The closer you live to the epicenter of the earthquake, the worse the outcomes, right? So is it sort of are you just in lockdown and you're worried about the outside world, versus is it like someone in your family has died or lost a job, or you have food insecurity, or your housing is insecure, right? And to what extent is it a crisis for you versus just a disruption of your life? There's research on that showing that when it becomes personal, when it's your family has been disrupted in major ways through loss of a loved one, through illness, through loss of food or housing, that is when you see much more serious outcomes that tend to be lasting, and more chronic and require more mental health support. And the other piece that comes from that existing research is unpredictability. As I think I mentioned earlier, is that when you're in a chronic situation of unpredictability, that takes a big toll.
Yeah, this makes me wish that Sharon Abramowitz was on this panel too, so I could ask her questions about epidemiology and education, because surely there's overlap with conflict in education studies. The studies looked at the impact of highly disruptive events in education systems. Surely those kinds of studies would be useful to a case like this. It's not. This is fairly typical in the world. It just hasn't happened in the U.S. since 1918, right? Where we haven't had widespread disruption from our public education, for 100 years. But it happens all the time in the world. Suddenly, it occurs to me why hasn't it occurred to us to be looking to other relevant scholarly fields to see what kinds of psychological, socio-emotional impacts we should be expecting to see on kids? He says ignorantly, as someone who's not in this field at all. But okay, let me just quickly scan for other questions. There was an early question. Have you recommended any specific, I guess again, Amanda, this is for you, specific executive function strategies or techniques for high school students? And in terms of sleep, most high school students, even pre-COVID, were sleep deprived because of homework, sports, and other demands. So, do you have any thoughts about reducing demands that interfere with sleep? Thanks.
I can speak to the sleep, and maybe Lindsay is better qualified to speak to the intervention strategies for executive function for that age, because I really focus on early childhood. But for sleep, I would say that there is a lot of research to support later opening times, that teenagers have a tendency to fall asleep later and later at night. And so that's part of what contributes to the sleep deprivation, is that they still then have to get up early in the morning for school. So if you're in a situation where your kids can sleep a little later, I would let them sleep as long as possible in the morning, and try, evening things that get in the way of them going to sleep are something to think about. Screen time and physical activity close to bedtime are both things that make it really hard to fall asleep. So in an ideal world, and I say this knowing that your teens will not be happy with this plan, but in an ideal world, for at least the hour before they go to sleep, they shouldn't be looking at screens. If that feels impossible, think about a blue light filter if you can, because it's the blue light that messes up your circadian rhythms and makes it hard to fall asleep. And trying not to have athletic activity really close to bedtime. Those are some of the factors to think about in terms of trying to improve teens' sleep. Lindsay, do you want to weigh in on the executive function strategies?
I was just going to say something really basic, and that is just to help with planning. So if there are a lot of competing demands on time, I think even older kids could benefit from, well, what do you have going on? How can I help you sit down and plan out your time? And what can what do you really need to devote a lot of attention to? What I do this with my 6-year-old, because she really perseverates on everything that she submits being perfect. And I was like, you did it, turn it in. It looks great, and just encouraging that you can't do everything when so much is going on perfectly. So give yourself some allowance to do things well enough. And then really focusing on kind of helping youth to prioritize, where should we really be spending our time if we feel like we don't have enough time to do everything we have to get done.
Okay, well, thanks for this. We have 10 minutes left. In the last few minutes, I want to give back to Ben and Lauren to give a closing benediction from the BPO. So I just want to spend the last 5 minutes or so just asking for your general advice for the winter ahead. I appreciate all the specific tips you've given and your general advice towards mindfulness, towards giving space for processing, and essentially your overall framework for making meaning with your family. Are there any other tips that you'd like to leave us with as we head into the winter months? Anything that you think we haven't really covered, or anything else you'd like to emphasize? Sanjali, I'll start with you.
Sure, I can start. So you mentioned this earlier, Stephen, in the call about using design thinking. Design thinking is really just a very simple problem-solving framework that focuses on the person that you are really trying to solve the problem for. And it's not even for, it's having them included in the design process. So we use a very simple design process called Feel, Imagine, Do, Share, which is actually a process that can be used in any part of your life for anything. Is the feel part is really about understanding the need, having empathy for the person that you're trying to serve, in getting to the root cause of what they're dealing with. Oftentimes we like to parachute in, even as parents, for our own children and solve a problem for them when that isn't really the root cause. We're addressing a situation at the symptomatic level. So we want to get to the root cause, imagining then and brainstorming possible solutions, and then critically analyzing them to think about what solution is feasible to move forward with. The do is implementing and acting on that solution and allowing for failure. One of the biggest challenges we have with our students today is that they're so scared of failure. It's the end all be all. So allowing them to fail, to learn, to iterate, and then continue, and then implement their solution, and then share back the solution with the people they've served, but with the broader community as well, to drive inspiration. So that is sort of the model we use at Design for Change. And it's just www.designforchange.us if you're interested in checking it out. And then the activities we have on dogoodfromhome.com. But it's a framework that can be used in any part of your life, but really it's not the end product that matters here. It's the journey and the process of which the skills of empathy and critical thinking and creative problem solving are built, which we feel like are the most essential skills that young people could be learning. And the pandemic doesn't change that. The pandemic actually intensifies the need for those skills right now. So if you have an opportunity to engage your students in doing, your children, I keep saying students, your children in some meaningful acts of service that follows maybe along those steps, you might call them something else, and that's totally fine. But just engage them as a mean of strengthening your family unit, but then also strengthening our communities.
That's great. Sanjali, and for design thinking resources to work on projects with kids, do you have any other recommendations? Do you have any recommendations, or shall we just post that link to the BPO's website?
You can feel free to post that link. IDEO has some really, really great resources as well. And then also, if you check out Stanford Design School resources, they're really wonderful. They're the pioneers of the field. We partner with them to simplify the process for children. But happy to connect with anybody offline if that's useful.
Yeah, we'll post your personal contact information on our webpage as well.
Awesome.
Lindsay and Amanda, any closing thoughts from either of you?
Sure, I'll just keep it brief and say I really appreciated Sanjali's point about how I interpreted it as looking at all of the opportunities that we will have in the winter. I don't mean to sound Pollyanna-ish, but I think if we do that cognitive refrain of not dreading the winter, but thinking about what can we do, how can we create opportunity, that might be helpful. But I also say, if you feel like this is hard, you're not alone. And I just want to name that this is really hard. The way you're feeling is probably the way a lot of us are feeling. And if you can be kind to yourself and engage in self-care, which we talked about at the top of the hour, I think that will help. But if you can't, if you feel like you're too busy, that's okay too. You're doing the best you can, and just know that you're not alone.
Absolutely. And then the last piece that I would just, want to add to that is just recognizing that you're focusing on what's most essential about your kids' development, which is really their emotional well-being. So that if some things fall through the cracks, if they don't learn decimals this year, or if whatever that might fall through the cracks because they're having a little trouble managing their emotions, that's okay, right? The most important things are their relationship with you, their relationship with peers, their physical wellness, including sleep and physical activity, and their ability to process their emotions. And if they have all that, and then they come out of this, everything else is gonna be all right. So just trying to adjust your family's dynamics to what will help everybody get through this okay. And not trying to hold everybody to a standard of perfection, like Sanjali was saying.
Well, then I just would like to say thank you, Lindsay, Sanjali, and Amanda, for taking the time, taking an hour and a half to talk with us tonight. I think I found your comments illuminating on what our families are going through, and I found your tips helpful. So thanks very much for this, and thanks also for such a positive frame of mind. I find this to be there are delights at this time for being home with family, and it's also an extremely difficult time. So I just also appreciate such a positive frame of mind that you bring into this conversation, and I think it'll be helpful for people listening. I hope so. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren for some closing remarks, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Lindsay, Sanjali, and Amanda for your time. Because really, if this is an hour and a half of that precious time we've been talking about for the last hour and a half, I'd love to think this was a self-care thing for you all, but I'm not holding any illusions, and it's probably time away from your families. So thank you so much for this time that you've given us. And I know that I've found this to be a very inspiring conversation. It's been reassuring to many of us because, the idea of forgiving yourself for not having it all worked out in your head of how you're going to support your child, and just the different shades of gray, that this is going to be experienced by different children in a very different way, that's both related to age, related to development, physical and emotional development, and just personality. I think I'd like to close on a slightly personal and anecdotal thing. Is my grandmother, who's about to be 103, this is her second pandemic. She lived through the Spanish flu. She lost her mother in the Spanish flu. And sadly, this pandemic has made her lose her mind. So I can't talk to her about what that was like. But when it all started at the very many years ago, I had a conversation with her about it. And I said, Grandma, what was it like to lose your mom at age 4? What was it like? And she said, you never forget it. You get through it. But my whole life, I've tried to make meaning of it. So what Sanjali says is resonates with me, and I think can resonate with all of us. In our family, our grandmother's experience, my grandmother's experience, my sister, my mother's experience, it's something that never left her, but it informed the way she led her life. She came through it. She was, she's an example of resilience. She's 103. She traveled till she was 96. She had 2 children. She has 5 grandchildren. She has great-grandchildren. And until very recently, she had a very robust, happy, healthy life. And now she doesn't really realize that she doesn't have a healthy, happy, robust life. So I guess what I'm trying to say, it's kind of a message of hope. She lived through it, and she lived a happy life, and she has had a full life. And I believe this experience, depending on the age of our children, will always be with them. But not only may it serve to make them perhaps more resilient, as I think it made my grandmother more resilient, they will make meaning from it. And I think that's something we can just hold in our minds and close with there. But thank you again. Thank you to our audience, to our participants. Thank you for the great questions you submitted. And everyone, take care, stay safe, stay healthy. Let's make it to April to get a vaccine. Okay. Take care. Good night. Thank you for joining the BPO for this conversation. And thank you to our panelists and to Stephen, our moderator. Thank you so much. Good night.